In 1905, Sigmund Freud published his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. This book is considered one of Freud's most original and influential contributions. The 3 essays on the theory of sexuality forever changed the way we think about human sexuality. Today, we will discuss the first of the 3 essays, titled, The Sexual Aberrations. In the second essay, which will be covered in a future video, Freud unfolds his vision of infantile sexuality, and in the third essay, he discusses the transformations of puberty. If you have this book on hand, which, by the way, is easily accessible on the internet, I suggest you take a look at the preface to the 4th edition, where Freud summarizes the main objectives of the text. The 3 essays, he says, underscore the importance of sexual life for all human activities, and broaden the concept of sexuality. But how does Freud broaden the concept of sexuality and prove that sexuality is determinant in many spheres of our life that we would initially think have nothing to do with sexuality? Well, instead of looking where one would conventionally expect to find human sexuality, for example, an adult heterosexual couple having sex, Freud relies on studying firstly sexual perversions, and secondly the sexuality of children. He goes to the periphery. That is, he first analyzes so-called abnormals, and people who supposedly would illustrate degenerate sexuality. Someone might think that there is no lesson to be drawn from such perverse practices for normal sexuality. In addition, in the second essay Freud talks about children. Well, according to common sense, children are presexual beings, because they have not yet developed, that is, they are sexually immature. However, working from the margins, analyzing and discussing what is found in this supposed periphery of sexual life, Freud redefines adult normal sexual life. In this preface, Freud reminds those scandalized by his theories that this expanded concept of sexuality bears resemblance to Plato's Eros. What is Plato's Eros? Freud is referring to the Symposium, a text written by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and in general, he is referring to Plato's concept of Eros as a force that drives us, a force that transcends mere physical lust and desire, weaving through a spectrum of human emotions and intellectual endeavors, significantly shaping various facets of our lives beyond the sexual act alone. In Plato's book, Eros is initially the god of love and erotic desire, but ascends beyond to cultivate a love for knowledge, guiding us towards philosophy and the pursuit of the idea of the good. I am not saying that Plato's theory coincides with Freud's, of course it doesn't, but it serves as an initial illustration that Freud's talk of sexuality goes far beyond explicit sexual behaviors. Let's move to the first of the 3 essays, called The Sexual Aberrations. The German word for aberrations is Abirrungen, which has more or less the same etymology in German as in English. In German, it comes from the German verb abirren, which means to err, to deviate from the right path. That is, we sometimes say that people who do not do things as they should, have lost their way, have strayed, deviated. Some behaviors are deemed deviant, and therefore perverse. But, before he starts to talk about perversions, Freud introduces a key technical term: drive. Freud defines the drive as a constant force that compels us to seek an object that satisfies us. An example of a drive is hunger. When we are hungry, we feel a bodily tension, a sensation of emptiness in the stomach that drives us to seek an object. We open the refrigerator, we want something gratifying. The satisfaction of the hunger drive occurs when we eat and feel satiated, with a full belly. Freud's use of the term Trieb, rather than the German word Instinct, is deliberate. Drive emphasizes the dynamic, endogenous energy prompting action. Instinct, by way of contrast, suggests the innate, pre-programmed and unchanging behaviors observed in the animal kingdom. James Strachey, the translator responsible for the standard edition of the complete works of Sigmund Freud, chose to translate Trieb as instinct, not as drive. This is controversial. If Freud had wanted to say instinct, he could have used the Latin-rooted word instinct, which also exists in German. Yet, Freud does not use instinct but the German-rooted word Trieb. It is true that drive and instinct are similar to each other. Both refer to that internal energy that leads us to act. But the word instinct places us in the field of biology, like the bird that always builds its nest in the same way, even without having to learn how to make the nest. Freud wants to avoid this connotation. His point is that when I am hungry or have a sexual desire, there is tension, because there is a certain amount of psychic energy that needs to be discharged through action. His analysis primarily revolves around sexual drives or libido, described as a form of psychic energy. We now turn to the first essay, which is divided into 7 sections. The first section is about deviations from conventional sexual objects. Here, Freud examines homosexuality, zoophilia, pedophilia, and fetishism. What do these different sexual practices have in common? In homosexuality, the object that produces attraction is someone of the same sex. In zoophilia, it is an animal. In pedophilia, it is a child. In fetishism, it can be a part of the human body, such as feet, but it also can be an object, such as a shoe or a piece of underwear. In each of these cases, the object of sexual attraction is not what current social norms designate as the normal object, for example, an adult person of the opposite sex. Freud presents, with a neutral, detached clinical tone, and without censorship, a catalogue of erotic tendencies, trying to find order within the apparent chaos. He works first on homosexuals, whom he calls inverts. The word inversion suggests the idea of going in the opposite direction. For example, in Buenos Aires, there used to be a gay club called Contramano, which means wrong direction, or against traffic. By talking about inverts, we remain within the metaphor of erring, or losing one's way, that we mentioned when we talked about the word aberration. The metaphor, now, is that of going in the opposite direction. The notion of inversion aligns with prevalent biases, portraying the homosexual's choice of sexual object as opposite to what is normal. This prevalent bias frames male homosexuals as men who prefer other men over women, suggesting that a male homosexual possesses the sexual desires typically attributed to women, drawn to the allure of masculine, robust bodies. And vice versa for women who like women instead of liking men. According to this stereotype, both the object of desire and the individual's gender expression are seen as reversed. The homosexual man is perceived as effeminate, aligning more with feminine traits, while the lesbian is viewed as masculinized, embodying qualities traditionally associated with men. This narrative perpetuates the notion of homosexuals as individuals whose identities and desires are misaligned with their biological sex, echoing the oversimplified idea of a person's sexuality being a misplacement of gender identity within the wrong body. Freud criticizes such oversimplification. Quote, "There can be no doubt that a large proportion of male inverts retain the mental quality of masculinity, that they possess relatively few of the secondary characters of the opposite sex, and that what they look for in their sexual object are in fact feminine mental traits." End quote. Essentially, these men, despite being gay, embody traditional masculinity. Their attraction to other men does not pivot on masculine attributes but rather on femininity present in their partners. This observation extends to male prostitution and is exemplified in the romantic dynamics between men in ancient Greece, where a preference for partners embodying feminine qualities was prevalent. In 5th century BC Greece, societal norms allowed a distinguished man to develop affection for a young boy, specifically an ephebe who had not yet grown facial hair. Freud posits that the allure was not the boy's masculinity but his feminine aspects, his resemblance to a woman, coupled with perceived feminine traits like vulnerability, timidity, and a need for guidance and protection. Once the ephebe matured, he no longer fit the role of the desired sexual object. This historical example underscores Freud's argument that homosexuality is not a monolith but encompasses a spectrum of expressions. He delineates types of homosexual orientations: absolute inverts, who exclusively engage with same-sex partners; contingent inverts, who may typically identify as heterosexual but engage in homosexual relationships under specific circumstances, such as extended same-sex company in the military; and amphigenic individuals, whom we would now refer to as bisexual, showing sexual interest in both genders. This diversity illustrates the complexity and variability within homosexual orientations. Freud explores whether homosexuality is innate, whether one could be born with a predisposition towards it, or influenced by life experiences. He acknowledges the possibility of congenital factors yet underscores their limited explanatory power. They do not provide a comprehensive understanding of homosexuality's origins. Freud also references the impact of traumatic events on sexual orientation. For example, he mentions childhood sexual abuse and what he calls seduction scenes. However, he notes the absence of a consistent sexual imprint from childhood across all cases. Consequently, Freud concludes that neither inherent predispositions nor traumatic events fully account for the selection of a homosexual object. Importantly, he refutes the notion of homosexuals as degenerate, affirming that homosexuality should not be viewed as a deficiency or abnormality. Some of Freud's claims may seem self-evident today, but they were groundbreaking for his era. He recognized that homosexual individuals can be as intelligent, capable, and ethical as heterosexuals, if not more. He also says that in many ancient peoples, in elevated civilizations, he mentions the Greeks, but this also happened in the 17th century Japan of the samurai. In these cultures, homosexuality was not merely tolerated but was a fundamental institution of social life. This suggests that homosexuality is not a degeneration. That is why in a footnote added in 1915, he says, quote, "Psychoanalytic research is most decidedly opposed to any attempt at separating off homosexuals from the rest of mankind as a group of a special character." And below he adds, "All human beings are capable of making a homosexual object choice and have, in fact, made one in their unconscious." End quote. For Freud, in the unconscious, we are all a little homosexual. Later he states, quote, "From the point of view of psychoanalysis, the exclusive sexual interest felt by men for women is also a problem that needs elucidating and is not a self-evident fact based upon an attraction that is ultimately of a chemical nature. A person's final sexual attitude is not decided until after puberty and is the result of a number of factors, not all of which are yet known. Some are of a constitutional nature, but others are accidental." End quote. In other words, Freud says that the reason why someone becomes heterosexual is as mysterious as the reason why someone becomes homosexual. Both problems require an investigation, a clarification. So, we see that Freud dismisses several possibilities. He refutes the idea that homosexuals are degenerates, emphasizes their diversity, and challenges the adequacy of attributing homosexuality solely to congenital factors. Freud concludes that there is a spectrum within homosexual orientations, ranging from absolute to occasional homosexuals, with numerous nuances in between. Additionally, some will be more influenced by congenital factors, others by traumatic experiences, and many by a combination of both. There will be those who seek feminine traits in their object and those who seek masculine traits, those who identify, see themselves as feminine, and there will also be homosexuals who feel masculine. There are pure homosexuals and there are bisexuals. This diversity underlines that homosexuals do not form a distinct group separate from heterosexuals. Instead, there exists a continuum of sexual orientation, blurring the lines between strictly homosexual and heterosexual identities. There are no clear limits but rather gradations. No one is purely homosexual or purely heterosexual. Building on this, Freud introduces the concept of inherent bisexuality in everyone, an idea enriched by his exchanges with Wilhelm Fliess. This perspective suggests that all individuals possess the capacity for attraction to both sexes. Bisexuality, Freud suggests, manifests not only biologically, as seen in hermaphroditism, where individuals are born with ambiguous sexual characteristics, but also psychologically. In this light, homosexuality is interpreted not merely as attraction to a same-sex individual, but rather as a compromise solution between desiring the masculine and desiring the feminine. The essential criterion for homosexuality, however, is that the object of affection possesses genitals of the same sex. To sum up, Freud is arguing that one's sex does not predetermine the sex of one's desired partner. The scope of human sexual attraction is vast and varied. This perspective challenges the conventional alignment of sexual drive with a specific sexual object based on one's own sex. Freud argues that we should uncouple the sexual drive and the sexual object. Being male does not mean that your object of desire is a woman, nor does being female naturally imply a desire for men. Freud briefly addresses pedophilia and zoophilia, placing them within the broader context of his discussion on sexual deviations primarily to round out his analysis, though he assigns them much less significance than he does to homosexuality. For zoophilia, he presents the example of a peasant who, isolated in the countryside and lacking a preferable partner, resorts to sexual activities with animals. In the case of pedophilia, he points to the distressing reality of children being exploited by those in positions of trust, such as school priests or gym teachers, a phenomenon frequently reported in the media. Freud suggests that the factors driving these behaviors include difficulties or fear in engaging with socially accepted sexual partners, as well as the presence of vulnerable individuals who serve as accessible targets for such acts. Opportunity often precipitates abuse, especially when potential victims are under the care of potential perpetrators. Freud concludes that sexual behaviors are not always guided by moral or rational considerations. Even when individuals recognize the wrongfulness of their actions or have no conscious desire to commit them, certain drives can prove overwhelming and compel behavior that is compulsive in nature. Let's move on to the second section, where Freud delves into deviations regarding the sexual aim. He posits that, while the conventional view of the sexual act is genital union aimed at tension relief and satisfying the sexual drive, it often incorporates elements akin to those seen in perversions. Now, think about your own sexual practices. Seriously, reflect on how you have sex. It's reasonable to assume that few confine their activities to mere coitus or penetration, which would arguably result in a monotonous and boring experience. A significant portion of sexual pleasure is derived from the preliminaries, caresses, mutual gazes, the allure of sensual attire, and occasionally, dynamics of dominance or submission. These aspects, enjoyable in their own right, serve to enhance arousal, underscoring that our sexual practices extend beyond coitus and are not solely focused on reproduction. For biology as well as for traditional morality, the function of sex is the reproduction of the species. Therefore, activities not aimed at reproduction, such as oral sex, pursued for pleasure, would be perverse under this definition. However, Freud challenges this notion with a touch of irony. He notes that even among the most civilized societies, kissing is held in high sexual esteem. So, if you think that oral sex is perverse, what can you say about kissing on the mouth? Which, by the way, has nothing to do with the reproductive function. I imagine Freud smiling while writing this passage, discussing the mutual contact between the labial mucosae and noting that the body parts involved do not belong to the sexual apparatus and have nothing to do with reproduction, but are the entrance to the digestive tract. If we were to strictly define normal sexuality as reproduction-oriented, mouth kissing would fall into the category of perversion. Freud illustrates this contradiction by observing that, quote, those who condemn practices such as oral sex, which have no doubt been common among mankind from primeval times, as being perversions, are giving way to an unmistakable feeling of disgust, which protects them from accepting sexual aims of the kind. The limits of such disgust are, however, often purely conventional. A man who will kiss a pretty girl's lips passionately may perhaps be disgusted at the idea of using her toothbrush, though there are no grounds for supposing that his own oral cavity, for which he feels no disgust, is any cleaner than the girl's. End quote. The point is that actions like caressing, looking at each other, kissing in different parts of the body, blur the lines between conventional sexuality and what are traditionally considered aberrations or perversions. Freud says, quote, it is only in the rarest instances that the psychical valuation that is set on the sexual object, as being the goal of the sexual instinct, stops short at its genitals. The appreciation extends to the whole body of the sexual object and tends to involve every sensation derived from it. End quote. Our desires extend beyond just the genitals of the person we're attracted to. Virtually any aspect of them can arouse us. Freud says we tend to overvalue the body and the mind of the person we desire. Every detail of the person we admire captivates us, from the curve of their nose to the way their shirt perfectly complements them, and so on. Let me quote Freud. The same overvaluation spreads over into the psychological sphere. The subject becomes, as it were, intellectually infatuated, that is, his powers of judgment are weakened by the mental achievements and perfections of the sexual object, and he submits to the latter's judgments with credulity. Thus, the credulity of love becomes an important, if not the most fundamental, source of authority. End quote. Put simply, when we're enraptured by our object of affection, our critical thinking pauses. Every word from our beloved appears brilliant, even when it's stupid. Freud outlines two kinds of deviations in sexual aims. Firstly, activities like oral and anal sex, along with fetishism, are seen as anatomical transgressions. They involve areas of the body or objects not traditionally associated with sexual intercourse. Secondly, behaviors such as sadism, masochism, exhibitionism, and voyeurism, usually part of sexual foreplay, become the primary focus. In these instances, the sexual act, typically culminating in intercourse, may not occur at all, with individuals remaining engaged in these preliminary acts. Freud then delves into fetishism, illustrating this with the example of someone who has a particular fascination with their partner's foot or hair. In this scenario, the substitute for the sexual object might be a body part not typically associated with sexual activities or an item of clothing like underwear. This shift from a living person to an inanimate object often involves something linked to sexuality. Similar to how the object of our affection seems glorified and flawless during sexual excitement, fetishism involves projecting these idealizations onto a substitute object. Freud illustrates this with a reference to Goethe's Faust, where Faust, smitten with Marguerite, implores Mephistopheles, "Get me a kerchief from her breast, a garter that her knee has pressed." Those items are made precious solely by their contact with her. This demonstrates the extent of Faust's idealization, valuing even a simple piece of cloth because of its association with Marguerite. This happens a bit to all of us, to some extent. In his 1927 essay titled Fetishism, Freud connects fetishism to the castration complex. He theorizes that the individual struggles to accept that the mother lacks a penis, viewing the fetish as a stand-in for this absent organ. This belief, formed in childhood, is clung to as a denial of castration. However, Freud's earlier work, 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, does not explicitly link fetishism with castration. Next, Freud discusses fixations on preliminary sexual aims. Humans inherently enjoy watching and being watched, touching and being touched, embodying voyeuristic, exhibitionistic, masochistic, and sadistic tendencies. The line between so-called normal sexuality and perversion is thin. Freud points out, however, a possible distinction between what is normal and what is perverse. In the so-called normal person, such actions form part of the sexual preliminaries, like touching, kissing, or exchanging looks with a partner. In contrast, for exhibitionists and voyeurs, the thrill lies solely in the act of seeing and being seen, focusing specifically on the genitals. This preference completely replaces the normal sexual aim. The same happens in sadism and in masochism, terms derived from 2 renowned authors. The term sadism originates from the Marquis de Sade, known for depicting such practices in his works, notably in Justine or the Misfortunes of Virtue. Masochism comes from Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, especially from his novel, Venus in Furs. These literary figures lend their names to practices that, much like voyeurism and exhibitionism, exhibit a clear polarity between active and passive roles and a fixation in preliminary aims. Freud observes that the sexuality of most males exhibits an aggressive component, an inclination to subjugate, to dominate. Sadism would correspond to this aggressive component of the sexual instinct which has become independent and exaggerated and, by displacement, has usurped the leading position. Freud says that the active and the passive combine in the same subject, so no one is purely masculine or feminine, no one is purely sadistic or masochistic. In Freud's words, quote, "A person who feels pleasure in producing pain in someone else in a sexual relationship is also capable of enjoying as pleasure any pain which he may himself derive from sexual relations," end quote. A sadist is always also a masochist. In the third section, titled, "The Perversions in General," Freud discusses how many behaviors considered transgressive are actually common in the sexual lives of healthy individuals, hardly causing scandal even in his era, for instance, oral sex. He states, "Everyday experience has shown that most of these extensions are rarely absent from the sexual life of healthy people, and are judged by them no differently from other intimate events. No healthy person, it appears, can fail to make some addition that might be called perverse to the normal sexual aim. And the universality of this finding is in itself enough to show how inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach." Freud seemingly categorizes people into normals and perverts, yet this distinction appears more as a rhetorical maneuver. Essentially, he suggests that elements of perversion exist in everyone. We are all a bit perverse. Labeling such tendencies as negative or equating them with illness is misguided. The real question then becomes, is it possible to clearly separate perverts from normals? Freud argues that being labeled perverse or pathological doesn't depend on the nature of one's sexual aims, but on their intensity and exclusivity. According to him, a behavior crosses into pathology when it becomes the sole focus or fixation. Thus, while most people might find some pleasure in voyeuristic or exhibitionistic acts, it is the individual who pursues these acts to the exclusion of all else who might be considered perversely fixated. Freud then discards the prevailing doctrine in his time, which considered perversions as degenerations, and instead proposes the hypothesis that the disposition to perversion is the norm, beginning from infancy. The idea of placing perversions at the very heart of human sexuality was both controversial and revolutionary for his time. In the fourth section, titled, "The Sexual Drive in Neurotics," Freud introduces the striking concept that neurosis is the negative of perversion. What does this mean? The desires of a neurotic person, be it homosexuality, masochism, fetishism, and so on, are the same as those found in people labeled as perverts. The difference lies in whether such desires are expressed or repressed. Perverts express them openly, whereas neurotics repress them. In perverts, these desires are visible and active, and in that sense, positive, but in neurotics, they're hidden or repressed, and that's why Freud says that neurosis is the negative of perversion. In fact, since 1890, that is, 15 years before writing the 3 essays, Freud had been psychoanalyzing neurotics. He was more familiar with neurotics than with perverts. It was through his work with neurotic patients that he developed an interest in topics like perversion and infantile sexuality. We will see in the next videos, when we talk about the other 2 essays, that neurosis is in continuity with infantile sexuality and its perverse drives. The journey of sexual development is fraught with trauma and conflict for everyone. Neurosis doesn't resolve these conflicts, rather, it's an escape mechanism, transforming libido's drives into symptoms. In conclusion, in the 3 essays, Freud upholds the notion from his earlier research that sexual drives underpin neurosis, suggesting that neurotics experience their sexuality through their symptoms. Here, Freud explores the concept of the erogenous zone. Erogenous zones are parts of the body capable of producing sexual arousal, such as the mouth, anus, genitals, and skin. Human sexuality is not unified from birth but is constructed from multiple drives directed toward various erogenous zones. These zones, like the mouth or anus, are independent sources of sexual pleasure. Freud maintains that these partial drives and the corresponding erogenous zones are crucial in early sexual development and can play a significant role in adult sexual manifestations. The central idea is that sexuality does not follow a single natural path but is polymorphous, meaning it adopts multiple forms, multiple configurations, especially in the early stages of development. I believe we can now better understand why Freud talks about drives and not instincts. We can think of drives as influenced by culture, language, and a unique subjective history belonging to each individual. This allows the aim and the object of the drive to be variable. Section 6, titled, Reasons for the Apparent Preponderance of Perverse Sexuality in the Psychoneuroses, revisits themes previously explored, so we'll not detail it further here. Section 7, Intimation of the Infantile Character of Sexuality, sees Freud discussing how the sexuality of perverts and neurotics has remained in, or been brought back to, an infantile state. In perversion, there's an apparent lack of repression, meaning the dams of shame and morality, which typically curb the drive, are not as effective as in neurotic individuals. When Freud refers to neurotics, he is essentially covering most people, so that neurosis is the new normal. And, remember, we cannot draw a clear distinction between perversion and neurosis. Neurotics, just like perverts, have also retained their infantile sexuality, albeit with previously enacted repression. This discussion serves as a transition into the second essay, which focuses on infantile sexuality. I'd like to highlight the historical and cultural backdrop against which Freud published his work, a puritanical era dominated by Victorian morality, characterized by stringent repression. Despite these constraints, Freud courageously explored these subjects, aiming to expand the understanding of sexuality beyond the confines of his era. His ideas on sexuality faced skepticism and bias, similar to the reception of his seminal work, The Interpretation of Dreams. Over the years, Freud continuously revised and expanded the three essays, significantly enriching their content. The original version spanned roughly 80 pages, while the final edition extended to 120 pages, much of this growth due to detailed footnotes. Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider supporting the channel by subscribing. Thank you very much.